Okay, Dr. Jason W. Morrison, Theologist, New South Wales, Australia. We're going to go over this video from Murderous Minds on Ted Bundy. This is a wonderful video, and let's just see what we can find as we go through this.
This documentary is the result of extensive research looking at the life and mind of Theodore Robert Bundy to try and understand what drives an outwardly normal man to commit some of the most heinous acts ever recorded on innocent young girls who had their whole lives ahead of them. Some of the names have been changed to protect those who do not wish to be associated with what Bundy did. Some of the grotesque acts he performed on his victims have also been toned down. But the accounts are true, and the events surrounding the murders are as accurate as possible. But in truth, ultimately, there is only one person who knows what really happened. And thankfully, he is no longer with us.
So what we're going to try and do, we're not going to try and look into the murders themselves. We're going to look at the formation, the personality formation, or the serial killer formation that may have taken place with this man. Now, these are just my opinions. They're open to debate, they're open to speculation, but I think together we can enjoy the findings that this gentleman's made in this video. Brilliant video. I do ask you to subscribe to the channel, and I'll leave a link at the end of the video.
Theodore Robert Cowell was born in Burlington, Vermont on the...
Now, did you notice it's Theodore Robert Cowell? Theodore Robert Cowell. Now, identity's everything, isn't it? Your identity is everything. I can remember when my name was changed. My mother left my father because he was a womanizer. And at about the age of 7, the school teacher came into the classroom and asked if he could see myself and my sister. I think my sister was there. And they explained to us how our names were going to be changed. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think I was ever quite the same after that. It was coming to Christ and all the recovery and re-identification that comes with that helped me later in life through that. But I just want to point out, Ted Bundy was not his original name. And this is a very subtle but important key into the formation of this man.
24th of November 1946. His mother Louise was unmarried, and her pregnancy was the result of a fling with a sailor called Jack Worthington.
Now, here's another point in the formation of the man. He was born out of wedlock, which isn't uncommon, but he was born to a sailor who runs off. And this is really important. His father's name was actually Jack Worthington,
who abandoned her once he learned of her condition. In 1940,
condition meaning once he learned she was pregnant, he bolted. Jack Worthington bolted. And as a result of the union, Ted Worthington was conceived. But he was never named Ted Worthington, he was named Ted Conwell, Theodore Conwell.
1946, it was not considered acceptable to bear a child out of wedlock, and Louise opted to give birth in the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. The delivery was uneventful, and Ted was a normal, healthy baby. Soon after birth, Louise returned to her family in Philadelphia, who, despite the stigma at the time, welcomed her and her baby back into their home. However, it's thought that for a period of time during his childhood, Ted believed his grandparents were his mother and father.
Now, I can relate to that because when I was born, early in my childhood, my mother became very, very ill with a kidney disease to the point where she had to have a kidney removed. Now, this was all part of the trauma of being involved in a marriage with a man that was a womanizer, and the emotional effects obviously spilled into physical effects, which often happens. And my mother lost a kidney. She was very, very ill. She nearly died. She was in hospital for 18 months. And for most of my childhood, I was closer to my grandmother than I was to my mother and my grandfather. I didn't have a father at that point. But I can remember my mother would used to, when she got out, we'd go and visit her in hospital. And I didn't know who she was, really, to be honest. And then when she got out of hospital, because I was so used to being with my grandmother, I'd scream and scream a night when they tried to take me. My mother tried to take me to her place next door. They lived next door, luckily enough. I'd scream and scream and scream until they let me go back to my grandmother. Because I was more comfortable with my grandmother than I was with my mother. Bizarre, isn't it? So I can relate to what's happening here in Theodore Bundy's life.
And his mother was his sister.
He thought his mother was his sister. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's really all happening.
It was also thought that although Ted spoke fondly of his grandfather, it was rumoured that there was a far darker side to him. A side that the vulnerable young Ted was exposed to from an early age. His grandfather had a violent temper that often culminated in physical violence, and was known to be abusive to animals. He also had a disturbing collection of pornography that young Ted had discovered and viewed from a very young age.
Okay, so the grandfather was a deviant. He liked pornography, and he also had an abusive side, which means he was probably unsatisfied with his life. And when you are on the end of that kind of physical abuse, actually later in life you think you have permission to be able to use it yourself because you've been on the end of it and nobody stopped it from happening to you, so why should anybody stop, this person who's experienced it to make it happen to somebody else? Do you see what I'm saying? It just goes on. That's why people that have been sexually abused were left at the mercy of in a lot of cases, the perpetrator, and then to repair themselves. So later in life, that makes them think, well, I can do that as well and probably get away with it. And this is how it all roller coasts on. But Ted's grandfather was a violent man and a deviant. And I think it says that Ted gets into the pornography himself at a young age.
Family members remember that Ted displayed some very unusual behaviours, even as a young child. On one occasion, when he was just 3 years old, his aunt woke to find Ted had placed kitchen knives all around her body as she slept. He was
Okay, so there's the deviancy, as Ted's obviously gotten into pornography, incites erotic feelings in young people. And this is where these erotic testosterone-like feelings begin to influence what they think's right or wrong. So at some stage, Ted's got this idea that maybe he thought by putting knives around this woman it might be protecting her. But what it leads to later in his life, this sort of thinking went the opposite way, didn't it? But there could be many reasons why he put the knives around that person's bed. Could it have been that he wanted to protect the person? Could it be that he valued the person? There's got to be a reason. But you can see right from the start of this video, he's had a very, very unusual beginning. But when you think about it, these days, this sort of upbringing's not uncommon, is it?
also known to scare family members with his sudden personality change, when for no reason he could turn from a sweet little boy into an unrecognisable entity.
Into an unrecognisable entity. Now you see this a lot today, don't you? You see the passive side where the person goes into a shell, and you see the aggressive side where they come out of themselves and put on this very strange behaviour, and at the end of the behaviour the child might cry or express some kind of emotion. But where he says an altered or an entity, I can understand fully what he means by that, because I'm sure you all have seen this or experienced this yourself, if you can remember back to your childhood. These type of persons are very, very strange, because they can frighten you, and they frighten the kids around them. But obviously something's going on that the parents and the people around this kid are aware of. Something unusual.
In 1949, Ted's mother inexplicably changed her son's surname from Cowell to Nelson.
Okay, so he's not been given his proper name, which is Worthington. He was called Cowell. And now the mother's changed his name to Nelson. So there's another identity upturn, another identity flip. And so now, I mean, some of you people might know what I'm talking about when you get your identity changed. It just turns you inside out. I mean, it's like taking away who you are and having to start all over again. I know that sounds dramatic, but that's what it's like. Particularly when it's not a result of a marriage or something like, personally for yourself, it's a result of what the people are doing around you. It is a real upturn. So now he's gone from what should have been Worthington, he was born Cowell, and now he's being changed to Nelson. Can you see what I'm saying, viewers?
Many years later, Louise revealed the reason for this was that she intended on moving out of the family home to live with her uncle, Jack, in Washington. His surname was also Cowell, so to protect her son from ridicule, she decided to change it.
Now, you've got to ask the question too, why would the mother want to go and move out of the parents' home and live with the uncle? There was obviously some upheaval in the house and things weren't going right there.
In 1951, Louise and Ted moved in with Uncle Jack, and the boy became quite close to him. It wasn't long before Louise met and married John Bundy, a war veteran and cook.
Now, so hang on a sec. Ted's finally got Uncle Jack, who he can build a bit of an identity off and have as a role model. But in the middle of this, before he could really sort of form himself off Uncle Jack, now he's got a stepfather. And so he's gone from Worthington to Cowell to, what was that name? I've forgotten the name that they give him. What was that last name? I know that sounds a bit silly, but what was that last name? Let's just try and find it.
Many years later,
yeah, so
Louise revealed the reason.
He went from Cowell to Nelson. So he's gone Worthington, Cowell, Nelson, and
for this was that she intended on moving out of the family home to live with her uncle, Jack, in Washington. His surname was also Cowell, so to protect her son from ridicule, she decided to change it. In 1951, Louise and Ted moved in with Uncle Jack, and the boy became quite close to him.
So this time his name's Ted Nelson, okay? And he's just gotten very close to Uncle Jack, but as I said earlier, before he could form himself,
the family later settled in Tacoma, where Bundy. In 1949, Ted's mother inexplicably changed her son's surname from Cowell to Nelson. Many years later, Louise revealed the reason for this was that she intended on moving out of the family home to live with her uncle, Jack, in Washington. His surname was also Cowell, so to protect her son from ridicule, she decided to change it. In 1951, Louise and Ted moved in with Uncle Jack, and the boy became quite close to him. It wasn't long before Louise met and married John Bundy, a war veteran and cook. He soon adopted Ted, who took his now infamous surname. After a brief move to the country, the family later settled in Tacoma,
okay, so now he's got his final name, which is Bundy.
Where Bundy spent the rest of his childhood. His mother's union with John bore a further 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons.
Now you have the classic competition. Sorry, I've had to sit down, viewers. I've been going flat out for quite some time now. But now he's had to, my gosh, now he's competing with other children. And there's always a sense of loss when there's other children born to another father or another mother. There's always going to be a conflict, isn't there? So you think about it, this guy, Ted, poor old Ted, he would have had to have had a split personality, because he wouldn't have known if he was coming or going, would he? He just wouldn't have known. You think of all the ups and downs and changes and things.
Ted had a good relationship with all of his siblings, but was closest to his youngest brother Richard and his mother. His relationship with his stepfather...
Now, did you just notice he was closest to his younger brother Richard and his mother? He didn't get along very well with the 2 stepsisters, and I would imagine that they would have picked on him. Looking at my children, we got 5. The second eldest daughter, she just gave the young fellas, the 3 young boys, a terrible time. And I would not be frightened to imagine that this is what's happened to Ted as well. So that wouldn't have went down too well in terms of his view of females either. So what you've got is this young man that struggled with everything that his mother has done to try and get her life right. And so he'd have, in a way, he would have a resentment underneath it all towards her. And now he's got sisters to another father, half-sisters, that I would say would have been giving him a hard time because he gravitated towards the brother and the mother. Let's see where this goes.
Father was fractious, and the more intelligent Ed often clashed with him, sometimes resulting in physical violence. This friction intensified when Ted learned the truth about his illegitimate birth, when he stumbled upon...
So there's some physical abuse going on now, for whatever reason, I'm not sure. But there is physical abuse taking place now. And this would be contributing to his, to the fracturing and the undoing of his self-esteem, particularly his identity. Once you start getting beaten and stuff, you really go deep inside. And he probably was wondering why his mother was allowing this to happen. And the sisters would have been laughing at him after it, and there would have been all sorts of complications going on here. Now he's just found out that he's had a little illegitimate birth. They don't know who his father is. Now, could you imagine looking at your birth certificate, and do forgive me if there's someone watching this that this has happened to, could you imagine looking at your birth certificate and all of a sudden realising that they don't even know who your father is? We know it was a sailor by the name of Worthington, but they never ever put that on the birth certificate because at the home where he was born, the mother probably just didn't want to get the guy mixed up in it. But isn't that sad? See, Ted Bundy always believed that he had a normal upbringing, and he argued that when you watch his tapes. But no, it's been a pretty rough one.
Upon his birth certificate that stated his father was unknown. This discovery implanted a bitterness and resentment in Ted's mind that remained with him for the rest of his life. Ted's years in school were fairly uneventful, although from a very young age he had an unhealthy interest in sex. As he progressed to high school, he became...
An unhealthy interest in sex. Now I wonder what that means. An unhealthy interest in sex. Because being interested in girls isn't unhealthy. Let's get it in its right perspective. So what's an unhealthy interest in sex? Was it too much of an interest in sex? I mean, the guy's in high school now. We'll have to see how that pans out.
Became somewhat of a loner, who had just a couple of friends. He found it hard to adapt and was becoming increasingly isolated and out of place in the society he lived in. However, despite being socially withdrawn with a few friends, he was never short of female admirers. Although much to their displeasure, he never dated through high school. As he entered adulthood, he became more and more attracted to the opposite sex. He was good-looking, charming, and intelligent, but this outer shell was hiding an increasingly tortured mind, and Bundy saw himself as a loser and an outsider. During his high school years,
So what they're saying is Bundy had an extreme case of low self-esteem by the sound of it, with a lot of other psychological
Bundy
stuff.
was a keen sportsman, and although his achievements were limited, he did become an accomplished skier. He also became an accomplished thief. And as money was tight in the family, he would regularly steal things he needed, in particular his skiing equipment.
Theft is always a sign of some kind of, okay, it can be often a case of need, but sex can also be like a form of arousal, excitement, and things like that. People run off and hide, and then the next thing they're stealing, and it's kind of like an arousal, and they get this arousal feeling, and it just gets them into trouble. That's why a lot of these people in prisons and that, they feed on this arousal, but it only seems to surface when they're doing something wrong.
In 1965, Bundy graduated from high school and enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, although he became bored and lonely, and the following year enrolled at the University of Washington in Seattle. It was here.
So this guy's familiar with universities and things. Let's not kid ourselves. He knows how universities operate and how they work and all that kind of stuff. So let's just keep our eye on where this is headed, okay?
That he met the girl of his dreams. Her name was Stephanie Brooks. Stephanie was slightly older than Bundy and of a much higher social standing than him. But despite this, they became an item. Bundy was infatuated with Stephanie and was...
This would have meant everything to Ted Bundy as it would to any normal young man. Your first girlfriend really is a way in which, by nature, we seem to measure who we are. I can remember my first girlfriend, and we went to the pictures, and there was a couple of other couples, and then that was on the Saturday, and then on the Monday she didn't like me anymore. That really affected me pretty dramatically, because I never really got a reason why the girl didn't really like me anymore. But that just happens. But see, we're not... males today aren't educated in a sense of look forward to the best, but be prepared for the worst. See, relationships in early ages we can take too close to our heart. And we're not taught to have relationships properly and how to develop things properly and how to cope with the chaoses that come out of relationships. And this is where things can go terribly wrong inside a person. And so we're taught to go into a relationship and see the end as a wonderful, journey that's ended with fireworks and all. Usually that you don't get to the end of the journey for one reason or another, and you have to lick your wounds, as it were, and recalibrate yourself, and then try and find a way of going on. See, humans aren't designed to swap and change. Humans are not designed to swap and change partners and all this stuff. We're not designed for that. And when we do have to change for whatever reason, or this, that, and the other, it causes a tremendous trauma in our spirit and our soul. And what happens is you go into that place where you feel safe, but it may not necessarily be the best place for you to be. But this is because we're not designed to swap and change. Now, just let me say, it's on a different subject, but what a lot of people don't know about Adolf Hitler is, Adolf Hitler, in his early years, he met a Jewish girl. And it was the same case as this, but she didn't want him anymore. And some believe that it was his relationship with this Jewish girl, where he got let down, that instigated and triggered his will and spite to wipe out the Jewish people.
Desperate to impress her, but inwardly he felt he was not worthy of her, although he had this remarkable ability to hide his inner turmoil.
Now, this is an uncommon among young and old males. We all have our moments of insecurity, and that can cause us to make wrong decisions in our relationships, and it can also cause us to treat the woman in our lives not the way that we should. And the funny thing about it is women are very, very sensitive to this, and they don't like it. Women like the sense of confidence and foresight. But what happens is when we lose our confidence because we're with a beautiful woman, and she just knows how to work a life, this insecurity is possibly one of the main factors in the undermining of most relationships. And for males that can't deal with it, you'll find that they look for other vices to try and manage themselves, like alcohol or cigarettes and maybe even drugs. But these don't help them in their course with the woman, because women can tolerate that stuff for a little while, but they don't, unless they smoke and drink themselves. The normal, person that's just wanting to have a happy, intimate life won't tolerate all that. So again, trying to fix the problem can, in some cases, only make it worse. But here we see Ted Bundy has now found himself someone that he can love.
Inwardly, he felt he was not worthy of her, although he had this remarkable ability to hide his inner turmoil. Stephanie finally ended the relationship in 1968, and this is when Bundy's already fractured mind began to unravel. He decided to leave Seattle and university, telling family members the memories were too painful and he needed to get away. Bundy left Washington State in the winter of 1968 and headed to San Francisco, before flying to Denver to ski, and then Philadelphia to visit family. He later returned to Seattle to try and piece his life back together. But by now...
I just want to say, at this point, Ted Bundy's had a taste of what it might be like to love a woman. So he's got an unsatisfied part of himself that's had a taste of what femininity can be like, but has been unable to experience it in a satiating and full, healthy way. So now he's probably got intimacy and attention deficit, and this is what is a big problem in modern society today.
Now, the breakup had taken an irretrievable toll, and Bundy's mask of charm and respectability was hiding a very disturbed character. On his return to Seattle, Bundy worked a couple of jobs, first in a Safeway store, then in a hotel washing pots, a job he left under a cloud due to allegations of stealing. Then, after a chance meeting with an old friend, he started working for Art Felcher, a city councilman who was campaigning to be nominated for the Republican lieutenant governor. He worked hard and was liked by everyone. However, similar to other stages in his life, he found it difficult to form any real friendships. When Fletcher lost his bid to be lieutenant governor, it was a crashing blow to Bundy, who had aspirations of becoming more involved in political life. By now, Bundy's inner monster was beginning to surface, and he...
Can you see? Nothing is going right for this Ted Bundy. Nothing.
He had become a prolific peeping Tom, creeping around at night, spying on unsuspecting women.
Okay, so he's got an intimacy deficit. He's got it now, which has turned into a fascination for women, which is driven by the same lust and arousal that he experienced when he used to steal. So this inner lust and arousal now, this little game he was, I call it a game that you have with yourself to try and get those feelings, is now directed towards women, but in a dysfunctional way.
He also had an extreme obsession with violent pornography. With his political ambitions hampered, Bundy decided to return to education, and in January 1969, he enrolled at Temple University in Philadelphia. By now, the dark thoughts in his mind were out of control, and he was getting increasingly drawn to act out his desire to abduct and rape a woman. It's uncertain whether he did murder any women in Philadelphia.
See, where the build-up's probably been is in the fact that he hasn't been able to either initiate or maintain a good, healthy, intimate relationship. And the deficit now is, after he's had a taste of it, it's like a dog when it's bitten somebody and it's tasted blood. Some dogs you just have to put down because they're going to bite again. Here, this is, and I'm not saying that Ted Bundy is an animal, even though he's sort of, that some people call him that, but in a human sense, what's happened now is he's had a taste of what it's like to be loved and he's valued that, but he hasn't been able to navigate that into a good, healthy relationship at this stage. So now the lust and the arousal that he senses when he thinks about women has got him being a peeping Tom and all other sorts of things.
Although many believe it's likely he did. Bundy did not settle in Philadelphia, and after just a few months returned to Washington State and rented a small apartment in Seattle from Ernest and Frida Rogers, who, like everyone else who met him, viewed Ted as a model tenant, polite, helpful, and never rowdy. Bundy...
Now this is a really interesting point, and this is what I want to say. And I'm not being critical of anybody, but what you will find on the surface is usually not what's going on underneath. People can learn very well how to disguise themselves, and it takes a duration of time with a person, and that could be 12 months, 2 years, to finally work out how they are and what they're really like. It's like being in a relationship and the honeymoon period wears off, as it were. This can happen inside an individual with themselves, particularly if they've got split personality.
He settled in Seattle and worked at a sawmill, and then as a messenger. In the autumn of 1969...
Now, I just want you to take note of that. He worked in a sawmill. And in some of his murders, he picked up pieces of wood, remember? And battered those girls in the university to death. Just remember, he worked in a sawmill. Interesting point.
He met a woman who was to remain in his life for the next 6 years. Her name was Liz Clover, and although Bundy craved a normal relationship, and Liz became very important to him, throughout their time together, he secretly dated many other women.
Okay, so the report is he's finally got someone that's prepared to value him and love him properly, but he is not satisfied to, now, he's not satisfied to do that. Just let me explain. What happens in this case, and I don't know all the clinical terms, but I'll try and explain it experientially. What happens in this case is the insecurity. The insecurity starts to surface. So he's being loved properly, or as properly as possibly you can. A lot of people can only love at the ability of what they know love is. And so Ted now has a relationship in which there's potential for this to be a good, healthy, sound relationship, but he's undermining it now through his need to undergird himself by having options, female options. Now, whilst he's thinking he's undergirding his security, he's actually undermining it, because women won't tolerate that, I can tell you.
Initially, Liz rejected the intoxicated Bundy's advances, but after seeing him with another woman, she gave in to his good looks, dapper dress, and charm, and the two hit it off immediately. Although some of what Bundy told her about his life was a lie, as by this time, Bundy had become a compulsive liar. Liz was intrigued by Bundy and his unusual...
Now let's just take note of that. Bundy has become now a compulsive liar, and this is unfortunate because men do lie to women quite a lot. There's a show on, a series actually on Netflix, for those that have Netflix, called Dirty John, and it's a terrific rendition of this guy called John and how he lied and tricked and cheated this lovely woman. And again, we have this case here of Ted going down this path.
usual accent, said to be much closer to an Englishman than an American. Liz had a younger daughter from a previous marriage, and Bundy soon embraced his new family and thought he had found the normalness he craved.
It's very difficult when you're in a relationship and the woman has a child of their own to another man. Now, Ted would have understood and probably embraced this in the sense that he was one of these children himself. He understood what happens to a child that hasn't got their proper father. So, in a way, Ted's probably embraced this in a sense of that he could rescue this girl from the predicament that she was in not having a father.
However, something stronger was still festering in his psychopathic mind, and despite this newfound connection, these heinous thoughts were still very much alive. Over the next few months, Ted and Liz's relationship grew, and they were both introduced to their respective families, who were pleased with the union. And although not officially living together, Ted spent most of his time at Liz's apartment. Liz, who was completely hooked, even helped to fund his return to university. And in the spring of 1970, Bundy again enrolled at the University of Washington, and ironically, declared his major in psychology. He also started working as a delivery driver for medical supplies, some of which he would steal and use in a grotesque way on his murder victims. Despite this newfound stability in his life, Bundy was still a masterful peeping Tom who stalked and spied on women at night for sexual gratification.
Exactly, it was for some kind of deviant sexual gratification which he developed out of the dysfunctionalism of his upbringing.
And all the while, his fantasy of abducting and murdering a pretty young girl was getting stronger and stronger. Over the next few years, with Liz by...
He's developing a case of stealing material things is developing now into a case of, through his will to steal and his will for lust, is turning now towards femininity.
By his side, Ted transformed outwardly from the socially awkward failure to a confident, academically successful man. To those around him, he seemed to have a bright future ahead of him.
Now, I just want to say, this is what can happen when you have somebody there for you that meets your needs. Obviously, Liz was a good influence on Ted, and he's gotten through university, and he's come out the other side with flying colours. That's what stability can do. But he neglected, he didn't know how to manage his stability. He was too unstable himself. It was all a facade.
And when in 1973, he was finally accepted into law school, he again caught the attention of his first love, Stephanie Brooks, who suddenly had a renewed interest in the man she had cruelly discarded. The two started to see each other again, however unknown to...
Now, there's nothing worse than being rejected by a girl and then going back for more. This man's got a good lady by the name of Liz, and now he's undermining that by going back to this one.
Stephanie. This was just payback for Bundy. After all, he was still in a stable relationship with Liz. But this was his chance to reap revenge for her rejection.
Now, I can understand that. I've seen this happen. People get rejected by people and then get a second chance, but they only go back to do some damage for what's being done in the first round. It's not uncommon. It's very, very, very alive today. This is not uncommon.
And proved to himself he was good enough for her, after all. Bundy did this by courting the unsuspected Stephanie and asking her to marry him, an offer she willingly accepted. Yet he had no intention of marrying her, and not long after he dumped her. In his mind, it meant he had won in the end, and the wrong had finally been made right.
So that was his first assault against femininity. Okay, you've done this to me, now I'm going to do that to you. Now, he would have got a real bent sense of satisfaction out of that, and here we go, I believe. It spirals downhill from there. Everything begins to culminate because now he knows that he can win. But he's not winning the right way, he's winning in a dysfunctional way, a very dysfunctional way.
Bundy had sought the justice he thought he deserved. He carried on his life with Liz, and to the outside world, he was a model of a successful, well-adjusted man, who remained active in local politics.
And how Liz never found out about Stephanie, I'll never know. This guy was one of these people, which it goes to show he had something wrong with his conscience, because he'd done all that without Liz even knowing. I don't know how men do that.
And was a person people looked up to. He was even somewhat admired. But unbeknown to those around him, his urges were getting stronger, and it was only a matter of time before he committed his first recorded crime. The respectable persona he had cocooned himself in was concealing the inner monster that was looming ever closer to the surface. In 1971, Bundy took a job as a telephone counsellor at the Seattle Crisis Clinic, where he met crime writer Anne Rule, who went on to write a book about her co-worker, aptly named The Stranger Beside Me. In 1972, Bundy graduated with a degree in psychology. He then took a job at the Harborview Mental Health Center. This job did not work out as he was not considered capable of being emotionally responsive to the needs of the patients. He also had a brief relationship with one of his co-workers, a woman it would later transpire had a lucky escape, as during their outings he used to drive her to remote rural locations. It was also one of the few girls that Bundy admitted to Liz in their brief separation. Ted struggled with this separation and finally pleaded with Liz to take him back, declaring his love for her. Liz, who was hopelessly in love with Bundy, forgave him and the couple were reunited. Next, Ted became part of the team to re-elect Governor Dan Evans, a job Bundy revelled in, as he was required to gain as much information as possible from Evans' opponent, Albert Rossellini. This sometimes involved wearing a disguise, something Bundy became renowned for during his murder spree. This new venture into politics saw Bundy rub shoulders.
So you can see how all these things are fitting together. He's taking the natural things in life, like he's gone and had to disguise himself so he could, not be seen by the people he was investigating. And he's taken all this in and he's accumulating it and he's putting it towards in his toolbox for when he's going to kill someone.
With some of the most prominent figures in Washington state politics. But Bundy's nocturnal behaviour was increasing, and he would regularly roam the back streets at all hours of the night, planning his next move.
Because that's what gave him his thrills. That's what gave him his arousal. This deep, rebellious, antisocial behaviour was meeting an internal satisfaction, an internal need. He was being satisfied by his evil behaviour. That's what aroused him. That's what he was looking for. That's what he wanted.
Liz was also noticing a change in the man she adored, and on one occasion, she discovered surgical gloves in his pocket. Little did she know of the madness in her man's mind, and the horrific consequences of it. His urges were now so strong that it was only a matter of time before he acted out his inhuman fantasies and what he had been planning most of his life. In 1973, after a brief and unsuccessful stint at the University of Puget Sound in Washington, Bundy made the decision to move to Utah the following summer.
So he's failed in that uni, something that's very humiliating.
And enter the University of Utah Law School. But by the end of 1973, and with the new year looming, Bundy's mind was focused and set. He was about to ignite a wave of terror unlike any other, as he finally unleashed his sadistic thoughts and made them a reality, meaning no woman within his reach was safe.
And what we'll do there, viewers, we'll see how the comments and everything go on this. I'm sure there'll be all sorts of things said. It's not the best production. I just thought I'd give it a go. Do make a comment on my thoughts, which are debatable and speculative. They're just thoughts. This is Dr. Jason W. Morrison, theologist, New South Wales, Australia. Bye for now.